So just so that we're clear, photosynthesis and cell respiration are happening everywhere. And I like to point out that cell respiration is also done by plants. I guarantee you that I will ask you a question about that. And I guarantee you that when I ask a question about cell respiration, one of the wrong choices would be only animals do this, and that someone will pick it, because it happens all the time. So maybe this can be the year that things change. Remember that plants have to perform cellular respiration. The other thing I like to point out is that, yes, photosynthesis requires light. Does that mean that cellular respiration requires dark? It does not. Cellular respiration can happen anytime. And that's another misconception. If photosynthesis happens during the day, well then cell respiration must only happen at night. Now, it does happen at night, but it can also happen during the day. So that's just a little bit about when these things happen and some common misconceptions that people have. What we're going to do first is talk about cells specifically, which I asked you to look at in your textbooks the other day. Now, it's not every single part of the cell that interests us, really, when we're talking about photosynthesis and cell respiration, because not all of them play a directly related role to that process. There are two components of the cell that are incredibly important to me for you to know. So, I don't think you need to draw an entire cell. What you need to be able to recognize is how a chloroplast, this guy, or how a mitochondrion, this guy, might be represented visually. So I think it's in your best interest to sketch out a little picture of a chloroplast and a mitochondrion. A chloroplast generally, if there's color available, is shown as green, but that's not always the case. So what you're looking for in a chloroplast is sort of an oval-shaped thing, like a rectangle with rounded corners, that has some kind of little circles or stacks in it. Now, I'm not a very good artist at all, but sometimes what you might see for a chloroplast are what look like little stacks of pancakes in the picture. But for a chloroplast, you are looking for an ovally rectangle type shape with some kind of little circly bits on the inside. A mitochondrion has the same basic shape as a chloroplast, but it's usually a little bit rounder. It doesn't look as straight on the sides, so if you look at the picture, it kind of has a bump in the middle. So it's the same general shape, but maybe not as smooth on the outside. But the distinguishing characteristic of mitochondrion is what's on the inside. It's not a bunch of little circles. It's a space with a nice curvy, wavy outline to it. And that's really quite distinctive, the wavy, bent, curvy membrane on the inside. And so if I was to show you a picture of a cell, I would expect that you could pick out a chloroplast and you could pick out a mitochondrion. The other parts of the cell, while they are important for the cell to function, are not parts where photosynthesis and cell respiration are directly happening. And so the only other part that I'm going to mention right now is the cytoplasm. What we'll end up seeing is that for cellular respiration to happen, some of it actually happens in the cytoplasm, which is just the space in the cell that is not an organelle, and the rest of it happens inside the mitochondrion. Now up to there, does anyone want to ask any questions about chloroplast or mitochondrion? So what I would like to do, where's my little thingy? Oops. What I would like to do is just talk to you a little bit about what's inside the chloroplast and the mitochondrion. So we'll start with the chloroplast first. I'll make it green. Since we're focusing on the chloroplast and what it looks like, here are some vocabulary words that you're going to have to know. First of all, chloroplast, much like a cell, is filled with a gooey fluid on the inside. That space is called the stroma. You would absolutely need to know that word. Now, each of these little stacks of circles, that looks like a stack of pancakes, is called a granum, or if you want plural, it's grana. And then each individual little sac, say one of those, is called, oh, whoops, that's French, never mind. It's called a thylakoid membrane. Those are vocabulary words that you need to be able to use, because when I talk about how photosynthesis happens, I'm going to refer to the grana and the stroma and the thylakoid membrane. So I need you to know what I'm actually physically talking about. Now, when we talk about a mitochondrion, which will have a wavy, curvy thing on the inside, the two things that interest us are that inside space, which is called the matrix, and the curvy, wavy membrane, which is called the cristae. So those are internal structures inside of a chloroplast and a mitochondrion that you need to be able to recognize visually or by their description. Now, you don't know what they do yet, because we need to spend a couple of days talking about what actually happens in photosynthesis. But once we get to the end of that discussion, I could come back and ask you what happens on the cristae, what happens in the matrix, and those would be things that I would expect you to recognize. But for now, knowing the word and knowing where it is in the organelle would be the key thing. Does anyone want to ask any questions about the internal structures? So then we are going to talk about just an overview. What are the basic things that are happening during photosynthesis and cell respiration? Because chances are you already know a lot of this stuff. And so I'm going to ask you guys, before I just tell you, does anybody know what you need or what you produce when you do photosynthesis? It could be either or, something you need or something you produce. Go ahead. So what is that, a need or a produce? Okay, so when I'm doing photosynthesis, and I'm going to represent photosynthesis in this part of the diagram. So photosynthesis is going to be happening where the chloroplast is. Samson just told me that I produce glucose, which is correct. It's a sugar. Does anyone know the formula, chemical formula for glucose? Yeah? It is C6H12O6. You would need to recognize the name or the formula. I could ask either way or either thing. So glucose, C6H12O6, is a product of photosynthesis. Does anyone know what the other product of photosynthesis is? So that we can breathe. Oxygen, there we go. So you would need to recognize for oxygen, same thing, the word or the formula. Now you'll notice, as I've drawn this out here, that there's another little arrow sticking off to the side of the chloroplast. Does anyone know why there would be a little arrow sticking off to the side? Okay, then maybe I'll leave it until we come back around the circle. So plants perform photosynthesis. On this side, I have an animal, the moo cow, but I also have a plant, the grass that he's eating. Both of those things can accomplish cellular respiration. So cell respiration is what's happening in your mitochondrion. And notice how the arrows from glucose and oxygen just keep going around. Those exact two substances that I just made in photosynthesis are going to be my starting point for cell respiration. So if I think about photosynthesis, these are the products. If I think about cell respiration, these are the reactants. Reactant and product is a piece of vocabulary that you should be familiar with. A reactant is what you start with in a chemical reaction. A product is what you end up with at the end. So for photosynthesis, glucose and oxygen are the products. For cell respiration, glucose and oxygen are the reactants. Now on the bottom, we need to fill in the space between photosynthesis and cell respiration first. So I'm going to ask, does anybody know either the products of cell respiration or the reactants for photosynthesis? Because you'll see it's the same two substances. So if it didn't rain, a plant would die. What would the plant be missing if it didn't rain? Yes. Nutrients that the water may carry, sure, but very specifically the water. So water is one of the things that goes down here. Water, H2O. Now, I'm putting liquid, and I want to explain why. Plants absorb liquid water from the soil, and cell respiration generally is happening inside someone's body or inside an organism where there's no way it gets above 100 degrees Celsius. And so even though water can be a solid or a liquid or a gas, it absolutely has to be a liquid when we're talking about photosynthesis and cell respiration. Liquid water. Water could evaporate from a plant and then be in the gas form, but when we're talking about this process, we would always focus on liquid water. Now, does anybody know the other product? It's what we breathe out after we've taken in oxygen and done stuff to it. Carbon dioxide is the other part. So you would need to recognize the word, carbon dioxide, or the formula. CO2 has to be a gas. We are not working with solid CO2 or liquid CO2. We are definitely working with a gas. So, if we do the same comparison we did at the top, for cell respiration, these are the products. For photosynthesis, these are the reactants. So it would be very common for us to say that photosynthesis and cell respiration make up a cycle. For cell respiration to happen, photosynthesis has to have happened. For photosynthesis to happen, I need the products from cell respiration. So one follows the other in a nice long cycle. Now I'm going to talk about the other arrows. Over here, let's talk about the fact that I require the sun. Without the sun, I cannot perform photosynthesis. I require energy from the sun. So the sun provides energy for photosynthesis. It's adding energy in. That means that if I had to classify photosynthesis, I would call photosynthesis an endothermic reaction. It's a reaction that is absorbing energy as opposed to releasing it. On the flip side, cell respiration is going to produce absolutely some heat, as well as something called ATP, which is the name of the molecule that provides energy. Since cell respiration is providing energy, we would call this an exothermic reaction. So they are really quite the opposite one of the other. One uses energy and is endothermic. The other produces energy, so is exothermic. One of them uses oxygen and glucose. The other one produces them. One of them uses water and CO2. The other one produces them. So if you, for example, knew what photosynthesis was like, you could rest assured that cell respiration is the opposite of that. And so it's a nice way to compare the two of them. Would anybody like to ask any questions about this little bit? So it would be realistic for me to ask you, thanks, on a quiz or on a test, hey, tell me how photosynthesis and cell respiration are related, or something about how they're a cycle, that one happens before the other. You need one for the other to happen. And drawing a picture like this, showing how the products of one or the reactants of another would be an excellent way to answer a question like that. The next thing I want to talk to you about is ATP. I don't think you need to draw the whole molecule. I wouldn't. There's a picture of it in your textbook, and I will never, ever ask you to draw it. I'm showing you a picture of it so that you can see where the name came from. ATP is a molecule made up of 3 phosphate groups, ribose and adenine, which together are known as adenosine. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. Now, although it would be great if you were confident that you knew what the abbreviation stood for, I would not be in the habit of making a question where the answer was ATP, but I tricked you and wrote the wrong words for it. I won't do that. If I say something that sounds like ATP, it's ATP. That's what I mean. It just stands for adenosine triphosphate because of what it's made up of. There is this big chunk here called adenosine. Its internal structure is not something I would ever ask you to draw or replicate. I just want you to see where the name is coming from. In adenosine, there's this ribose and adenine put together. And so, there you go. That's not really the part that interests us, though. The part that interests us is this thing at the end, the phosphate groups. There are 1, 2, 3 phosphate groups. And the energy in the bonds that hold those phosphate groups on is how your cells are going to get energy to work. So, it has high energy bonds that when they break can provide energy for other processes to happen. Some examples, and this is something that I would for sure ask you. What do we use ATP for? What are some examples? Anytime any muscle ever contracts, you require ATP. Anytime any cell in your body divides and replicates itself, not just sperm and egg here, not just new baby, this means you cut yourself and you need some new skin cells, you need ATP. Anytime a unicellular organism needs to move, or even a smaller cell inside your body, think about a sperm cell and how it has a tail. Anytime a cell needs to move, the flagella, which would be its tail, or the cilia, which are like little hairs on the outside of cells, for them to move, you require ATP. I'm going to add one more thing to the list here. It's something that hopefully you learned about before, active transport. In Science 10, one of the topics is diffusion, osmosis, active transport. And the idea was, and you would have read this in your book, that active transport is when we make molecules go against their concentration gradient. So we would want, instead of letting a molecule spread out, we would want to put it all in one place. You need active transport for things like producing urine that has lots of waste but not a lot of water. So active transport is helpful there. So basically, anything your cell does probably requires energy. And so ATP is often referred to as molecular currency. It's like your cell's money. It's how it does stuff. It's how it pays for things that it needs to do. Now this is where I'm going to stop talking about things on the screen. And the last little picture that's up there is actually quite like one that is in your textbook. And so I'm going to refer us to your textbook first. I'll leave this on the screen in case anyone likes this one better. But there's one just like this in your textbook. And then we're going to work on a few questions from there. Does anyone want to ask anything right away?